In my almost 3 years of streaming on Twitch, I've learned so much about OBS and everything connected to it. I wanted to start a series of videos where I share with all of you what I've learned along the way. In this video, we'll cover everything video related in OBS. We'll talk about scaling, output resolution. We'll talk about streaming in one resolution and recording in another, and optimal bitrate and resolution settings for Twitch. The first step in setting up proper video in OBS is navigating to the settings window and going to the video tab. In the video tab, you'll find 4 fields. The first one is base or canvas resolution. The canvas is the work area, which my face cam is covering in OBS right now. This should match the largest resolution you hope to encode. So if you want to stream 1080 and record 1440p, this should be set to 1440p. The next field is output or scaled resolution. This is the resolution that OBS scales the canvas to for output. This is the resolution that is delivered to the stream or recording encoder. This is also the most efficient way to downscale. So if you are playing 1440p and you're only going to stream 1080p and record 1080p, you should do your scale here and not on the encoder. Doing the scale on the encoder uses the CPU, so if you're on a single PC, it can use a lot of resources. If you want to stream in 1080p and record in 1440p, your canvas and output resolution should both be 1440p. I'll talk about it more later in detail, but the rescale will happen on the stream encoder. Like I said, this will cause a lot of load on the CPU and it's not as efficient as performing the downscale in the video tab, but it's the only way to record 2 separate resolutions. And this means 1440p recording, 1080p streaming on a single PC might be a little tough. Next field is downscale filter. If you're downscaling in the video tab, if your canvas is 1440p and your output is 1080p, for example, you'll want to choose bicubic here. I know most videos say Langkos. Bicubic is the best downscale filter for artificially generated material like overlays and video games. I'll show you later that you can right-click your camera source and change it to Langkos separately. Mid-edit art here, just want to let you know that if your downscale filter is grayed out, it's because both resolutions match. You don't get to pick a filter if the resolutions match. You only get to pick a downscale filter if you're downscaling. The final thing is your FPS value here. Most people playing games online or just chatting will want to set this to 60 frames. Like I mentioned, bicubic downscale is a more efficient and overall better choice for artificially generated graphics like overlays and video games. But Langkos is still recommended for real-world material like cameras. So if you select your camera source in OBS and you right-click, you can choose scale filtering mode and set the camera itself and any other cameras in any of your scenes to Langkos. The next panel is the stream panel. I stream on Twitch, so I have my account connected through their web API by logging in the app. Connecting your Twitch account this way gives you access to bandwidth test mode. Bandwidth test mode lets you stream without actually going live, and it's a great way to test streaming encoders and recording encoders at the same time. One of the most important settings in the stream window is the ignore streaming service recommendation setting. Without checking this box, none of the special settings we put in later in the output streaming window are going to make a difference. Your stream output will always adhere to the rules enforced by the streaming platform. In our case, Twitch's 6K limit. The next thing we'll go over is the output panel. I'll show you guys specific streaming and recording encoder settings later in the video, and I've opened another instance of OBS without my settings in it, just so I can show you different encoder options while I'm recording. If your output window looks like this, you'll want to change the output mode to advanced at the top. The first tab we'll cover is the streaming tab. The streaming tab is responsible for the encoder that delivers your canvas output to your streaming service. In my case, that's Twitch. At the top, you'll notice you'll have 2 audio options. If you guys want a full video on the VOD trick, let me know in the comments below. The next option here is encoder. Now, this is going to look different for everybody. In my case, I have an NVIDIA GPU installed, so my 2 options are X264 and NVIDIA NVENC. X264 will perform the encoding of the stream on the CPU, while NVENC will perform the encoding of the stream on the GPU. Like I said later in the video, I'll give you guys specific settings for single and dual PC, but the general rule here is if you have an NVIDIA graphics card on a single PC, you should be using it. X264 encoding will be way too processor intensive while playing a game. The next option here is rescale output resolution. Now, we touched on this a little bit in the video tab, but in my case, I record 1440p and stream in 1080p. So my video tab, my canvas resolution is 1440p, and my output resolution to the encoders is also 1440p. So in the output tab, I would want to check this box because I stream 1080p to Twitch. Now, as I mentioned when we were talking in the video tab, checking the rescale output box in the streaming tab is going to perform the downscale on your CPU regardless of your encoder. It's a lot less efficient to do it here, but it's the only way to stream 1080p and record a larger resolution. This means recording 1440p and streaming 1080p might not be as realistic for single PC users, but you'll have to test to see how it affects your system. If you choose to do the downscale in the video tab, like shown here on the screen, you do not need to check the rescale output box in the encoder. This is probably a good time to take a second to talk about bitrate and resolution on Twitch. You've probably seen other streamers streaming at resolution resolutions just under 1080, like 864, 900p, or 936p. Why would they be doing this? The limit for Twitch's bitrate for everyone, now affiliates and partners are probably prioritized heavier, is 8,500 kilobits per second, including audio. If you stream at a lower resolution like those that I mentioned, you can make use of Twitch's bitrate a lot more efficiently, while it is a lower resolution. 720p and 864p are technically the two cleanest downscales from 1440p and are going to be the least blurry, although those are pretty low resolutions in 2023. I personally wouldn't stream at 900p or 960p, as those numbers aren't evenly divisible by 8 and they can cause scaling issues in certain viewers. A lot of people choose 936p for this reason because it downscales properly mathematically. I personally still stream 1080p because when I'm just chatting or objects are very still, it does look very, very sharp. The next tab in the output window is the recording tab. This is where you configure all settings for your local recording encoder. Yours probably looks like this, and most people have an NVENC card. So right off the bat, you'll want to change it from Ustream encoder to NVENC H.264. I still use NVENC to record local clips because when you feed NVENC enough bitrate, whether through CBR or CQP, it's always going to outperform your CPU in terms of efficiency. Here, if you configured your video panel like we did earlier, you will not want to check rescale output. What that means is OBS is feeding your 1440p canvas directly to the stream encoder so you can record your output at full 1440p resolution. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll go into detailed settings later, but the important thing here is that you record in MKV. Why? MKV is essentially the same file format as MP4. The only difference is MP4 exists in a header-footer structure. So that means when the file is beginning to be recorded, there's a header created. The file will not function until the footer is created to answer that header. What does that mean? That means if and when your stream ever crashes, that recording will be corrupted unless the footer was created. The MKV file format is almost exactly like the MP4 file format. It just doesn't have that header footer structure. There's two options here. You can go to Advanced and you can go to Recording and you can check Automatically Remux to MP4. What does this mean? Remuxing is one step ahead of converting the file. Remuxing reorganizes the information in the file to another format. It's not as processor intensive and it doesn't take nearly as long as converting a file. If you're on a dual PC setup or a beefy single PC setup, I highly recommend turning this on. This means that your recording directory is going to have an MKV and an MP4 in it, but once that MP4 is made, you can delete that MKV. The MKV is just a failsafe in case anything happens while you're recording. If you don't want to automatically remux while you're streaming, you can uncheck this box, and when you're done, you can go to File, Remux Recordings, and drag your recordings into there and remux them at the end of the day. You can also see there's listed audio tracks here. If y'all want to learn about split audio recording, let me know in the comments below. The next tab is the audio tab. I'm going to do a whole video later on audio, but in general, if you're doing the VOD trick, you'll want your live track and your VOD track both to be 160 kilobits per second, because the combined audio limit of Twitch is 320 kilobits a second. If you're only sending one track to Twitch, you can set that singular track to 320 kilobits a second. Tracks 3, 4, 5, and 6 can be used to record other devices. Like I said, I'll make a video on that later on, but these can all be set to 320 kilobits per second. The final tab in the output window is the replay buffer tab. Replay buffer uses your recording encoder to constantly record a user-defined length of time. If you enable replay buffer and set a duration, let's just make it 120 seconds or 2 minutes, you'll see it estimates a memory usage. This is because the recording tab is currently set to CBR, or constant bitrate. Replay buffer can then use that constant bitrate of X kilobits per second to figure out how large that file is going to be. Why is this important? Replay buffer always holds that information on your RAM on the system until you hit save. The instant you hit save, OBS begins processing the data on the RAM into a recorded file. If you choose to use a higher quality recording mode like CQP, there's no guarantee that you have enough RAM to hold all of that data. That's why personally I use CBR to record my clips. Replay buffer is a super useful tool for saving clips while you stream in super high quality, but I just wanted to touch on the fact that it does save that data to your RAM before saving to your hard drive. So if you're on a single PC, while it could be a useful tool, if you record too long of a replay buffer, it could really affect your performance. I'll touch and expand more more on the different recording options and how they affect replay buffer later on in the video, but I just wanted to take a second to explain this. I'm not going to go too in depth on replay buffer in this video. If you want a full video on that, let me know in the comments below. I would figure most people watching this video are going to be single PC streamers, so that's what we'll talk about first. As far as encoders for single PCs go, 2023 is going to be a big year for Twitch. Hopefully we get AV1 adoption, which means a much more efficient encoder. If you have a 40 series card or an Intel Arc card, you'll be able to utilize that. I'm not going to cover that in this video. Currently, at the beginning of 2023, the best option for single PC is still NVENC. NVENC, for the most part, uses a totally separate chip on your graphics card to encode the video and doesn't affect performance, but maybe 5%. At the top of the streaming tab, in the output window, you'll want to select NVIDIA NVENC H.264. Once again, we'll talk about the rescale output. This is really important because it can cost you frames and performance in game. This will be something that you have to test, but if you want to record 1440p and stream 1080p, your video window should look like this. Your canvas resolution should be 1440p, and your output resolution should also be 1440p. In your output tab, under the streaming tab, you'll want to check rescale output and make sure it is set to the resolution you want to stream at. In my case, that's 1080p. If you're on single PC and you get a huge performance drop doing it this way, you notice drop frames in OBS, or you start to lose performance in your game, you'll want to go to the video window and you'll want to change your output resolution to 1080. This means your recordings will be limited to 1080, but your performance will not take such a huge hit. Assuming you didn't have any performance hit, you'll want to rescale output, set it to 1080 or whatever your desired resolution is, and we'll move on to rate control. This will be CBR or constant bit rate. This means the encoder is always going to target the constant bit rate that you set. For anyone on Twitch, the real cap is 8500, including audio. Setting this above 6000 doesn't guarantee you'll get transcoding or the ability for your viewers to switch to a lower resolution, but it does provide the highest quality. So you'll have to test this out for yourself. I'm only an affiliate and I get transcoding every day with my bitrate set to 8K. As I mentioned, we'll go in here and we'll set this to 8000 kilobits per second. The keyframe interval for Twitch is 2, so you'll want to change that to 2. Now, as far as NVIDIA preset, you'll want to use P4 or higher. These are the slower, high quality presets and will result in a higher quality image. The closer to 7 you go, however, the more likely the encoder is to use other parts of the GPU and once again cost you frames. I recommend P5 as a good starting place. For tuning, you'll want to set this to high quality. You can also try out low latency. I haven't used this encoder to stream in quite some time, but high quality should still be low latency enough while preserving the quality of your stream. Multipass mode is going to be another one of those settings that's going to cost you more GPU resources. So if you want max frames in game, or you don't have a beefy GPU in your single PC setup, you'll want to leave this on single pass. If you do have a beefy setup, you can try leaving this on 2-pass quarter or 2-pass full resolution. This is something that you should test over a couple streams, watch your VOD, and see how it affects the quality. Options like this on Twitch are usually very diminishing returns, so if it costs you performance and it doesn't make a big difference for stream, I'd recommend leaving it on single pass. Profile is the tune of H.264 that's being delivered to stream. For everything, including X.264, you'll always want to leave this on high. Look ahead is another one of those options that if you check it, it's going to start to use a lot of GPU resources outside of NVENC. What look ahead does is it allows the encoder to do just that. Look ahead and use B frames or compression frames to make more intelligent decisions about the compression of the video. Once again, this is a setting that starts to use GPU resources outside of the NVENC chip and can cost you frames in game. So I would test it and see if it's worth it. Psycho-visual tuning is yet another one of those settings that starts to use more of your GPU. What it does is it looks at the encoding and starts to reassign bitrate to more high motion areas. So for games like Apex, Warzone, any fast-paced multiplayer like that, it can really help increase the fidelity of your stream, but once again, it will cost you GPU resources and could cost you frames, unless you have something beefy like a 4080 or 4090. The GPU setting just tells OBS which GPU in the system to use for your encoding. Most of you all will have just one GPU in here, so this will be left at 0. Max B frames can also be left at 2. Once you have these settings input, you can hit apply. Once again, a couple of these you'll have to salt to taste. If you do have a modern system and it's very strong, you can try increasing your preset to P7, turning on 2-pass full resolution, enabling both look ahead and psycho-visual tuning, as this is technically the maxed out settings, but it's again something that you're gonna have to test and watch back your VOD to see if it really does help. If you're streaming on Twitch and you ever want to test these encoder settings, you can always go to stream and check bandwidth test mode. This allows you to go live and record at the same time without actually appearing live on your channel. Now, mind you, this is only available on Twitch. Now we'll move on to the recording tab. At the top, I leave this on standard. The other option is custom FFmpeg, and it's even too complex for me. Next is recording path. This is simply where your recordings in OBS are saved. You'll want this to be a fast internal drive like an SSD. If you save it to too slow of a drive like an old spinning disk or an external drive, high resolution recordings like 1440p or 4K will drop frames and not record properly. For recording format, you'll want this on MKV. Like I talked about earlier, MKV will prevent any lost data, and while it might not be editable in certain softwares in advanced, you can turn on automatically remux to MP4, or later you can go to File, Remux Recordings, and select your recordings, converting them to MP4 later on. Like I said, you can delete the MKVs later on, but if you record an MKV, if anything ever happens while you're recording, you're never to lose that information. It's better to have the extra step of remuxing than to lose your recording forever. For both single and dual PC, if you're running an NVIDIA card, the best option for recording is still NVENC. So in the encoder dropdown, you'll want to select NVIDIA NVENC H.264. Make sure it's H.264 because HEVC is the H.265 encoder, which I haven't played around too much with. The rescale output box in the recording tab will not want to be checked. This means that if you have your video tab set up like this, where the canvas and the output scaled resolution are both 1440, you will not want to rescale the video being delivered to the recording encoder because you want to record 1440p. If you're recording the same resolution that you're streaming, this doesn't matter to you. Now we'll move on to the actual encoder settings. CQP is what's recommended to most people for rate control, and it's what you'd want to use to manually record. A good range for the CQ level is anywhere from 16, which is very, very high quality and going to be a very large file size, to about 28, which is going to be the lower end of quality, but is going to help you with that file size. I personally use CBR because that lets replay buffer define the size of the file and makes it much easier to record clips on the fly. Like I said, if you want a full video on replay buffer, let me know below. For most people recording 1080 or 1440p, I recommend a CQP level of 23 to start. If you want more quality, go closer to 0, but try not to go over 12. 12 is insanely high quality. If you're fighting file size, you can go as low as 28 and not really see a huge reduction in quality. The way CQP functions is it tells the encoder to maintain a certain level of quality. So if you're in a very static or still scene, it will drop the bitrate very low. But if there's a lot of motion, explosions, a lot of action in the scene, it allows the encoder to use as much bitrate as it needs to within a quality parameter, QP, that you set. If you want to use CBR or constant bitrate for recording for size or replay buffer reasons, if you're recording 1080, I recommend a bitrate anywhere from 25 to 40,000 kilobits per second. If you're recording 1440p, that bitrate should be anywhere from 45 to 60,000 kilobits per second. Personally, I use replay buffer, and so I use a bitrate of 60,000 kilobits per second, both for recording and for replay buffer. Just to note, replay buffer will always use your recording encoder. For recording, you can leave your keyframe at 0. Now, for the preset, because we're feeding the encoder so much bitrate, you don't need to go as crazy and go P7. I recommend P4 is a good starting point. P3 or P2 would be fine too if you're dealing with system overload. Tuning will leave on high quality. Multi-pass mode, again, unless you're on a very strong system, you'll want to leave this on single pass. Profile will remain high. And for recording, we can leave look ahead and psychovisual tuning off again because we're feeding the encoder so much bitrate, or if you're using CQP, you're telling the encoder to maintain a certain quality. That's the end of the single PC section. Now, this is a perfect segue into the dual PC section. For recording on dual PC, I have a 1650 Super and I still use these NVENC settings. I've tried enabling look ahead and psychovisual tuning, but I have found it not to increase the quality of my recordings that much, so I leave those off. So the settings I just covered for a single PC will work for a dual PC as well. Now, in output, under the streaming tab, let's talk about this in terms of a dual PC setup. If you have a CPU with less than 8 cores and an NVIDIA graphics card, you should continue to use the NVENC settings we're showing on screen here. You'll have to adjust these to your own liking and test it out with a couple streams, but since you're on dual PC, you can use these without worrying about GPU overhead. NVENC is engineered to make a very watchable and human vision-like stream, which doesn't mean it will always be sharp. If you have a CPU with more than 8 cores like my 5900X and my streaming PC, I highly recommend giving X.264 a shot. If you can get the X.264 encoder to work on the medium preset at 8,000 kilobits a second, I have found this output to be much consistently sharper than NVENC. Setting up X.264 is a lot more simple than setting up NVENC. You only have a couple options here. You'll want your keyframe interval again to be 2 seconds. Here under preset, X.264 is only really worth it if you can achieve medium without dropping any frames. Faster and fast deserve an honorable mention here, but if you can only get very fast to be stable on your system, you should stick to the NVENC NVENC settings we talked about, I found X264 with the medium preset to be the sweet spot for quality to performance. For profile, you'll want to set this to high. Tune, you'll want to leave on none. All of these tune settings are made for specific content like animation or film. Some of them are even meant for testing, so it's best to leave these alone. The X264 options field is something that I've experimented with for half a year. In this field, you can enter extra options to tell the encoder to do special things to the video. I've experimented with RC look ahead, AQ mode, trellis, and direct pred, all from my research as ways of maximizing the quality in OBS. But I found these settings just to lead to drop frames, and from my research, the pre-configured presets are presets for a reason. They're the best combination of all of these variables in the H.264 library that are the best use case for our uses. If your CPU is really strong, like current gen Ryzen or Intel, you can experiment with running slow or slower, but make sure you're keeping an eye out for drop frames in the stats window. I'd actually like to take a second to shout out the stats window. It's probably the most useful tool in OBS. I'll do a whole short covering the stats window here in the future, but for now, the place to look out for is skipped frames due to encoding lag. With all of these different encoder changes and running bandwidth test mode, that's the field you're going to want to keep an eye on to see if you've overdone the encoder settings, single or dual PC. Shouting out all this X264, I'm not trying to naysay NVENC. If you're on a dual PC and you're not using your CPU at all, and you have a good enough CPU to encode on, it's worth giving it a shot. NVENC is limited to 2 streams of video, so if one of those is your recording/replay buffer and the other is your stream, you have nowhere else to record. So if you're trying to record in another instance of OBS for TikTok, we can make a video about that too, then it's important to free up one of those streams of NVENC. Putting your stream for Twitch on X264 is a great use of a strong CPU. In my testing, I found X264 to be especially good at maintaining face cam detail while in a gameplay scene with heavy motion going on. NVENC has a tendency to do this pulsing compression on the face cam that I don't see as often in X264 encoded streams. I think that about does it. Remember, if you're trying out X264 on the medium preset, be sure to check your VOD and ask chat to make sure you're not dropping any frames. Medium can seem fine if you're doing a bandwidth test stream, but as soon as you go live, things can change a little bit when actually talking to the Twitch servers. X264 encoding is very hard to achieve. Even my 5900X struggles sometimes with all of my animated overlays and all of the cameras. In later videos, we'll talk about best practices for scenes to make sure OBS doesn't get overloaded. If you have any questions about any of the content in today's video, then ask me in the comments below. I'm usually very quick to respond. You can follow me over on Twitter, art_is_war. I'm live almost every day on Twitch, twitch.tv/art_is_war. Go ahead and click like if I taught you something today. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell's clicked so you know when I upload another video. And until the next one, I'll see you guys later. Peace.